So you can see us now?
Yep. Yeah, we can see it here.
Hello, Mayor.
On behalf of the committee, I welcome everyone to this public hearing into the Territory Coordinator Bill 2025. I welcome via video conference to give evidence to the committee from the City of Palmerston, Mayor Athina Pascoe-Bell and Nadine Nylon, Interim CEO. Thank you for coming before the committee. We appreciate you taking the time to speak to the committee and look forward to hearing from you today. This is a formal proceeding of the committee, and the protection of parliamentary privilege and the obligation not to mislead the committee apply. This is a public hearing and is being webcast through the Assembly's website. A transcript will be made for use of the committee and may be put on the committee's website. If at any time during the hearing you are concerned that what you will say should not be made public, you may ask the committee to go into a closed session and take your evidence in private. Can you please each state your name and in the capacity of which you are appearing?
Athina Pascoe-Bell, the Mayor of the City of Palmerston.
Nadine Nylon, Interim CEO, City of Palmerston.
Thank you. And before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge my fellow committee members. I'm Andrew Mackay, the member for Goyder. We have Mr. Chansey Paech, the member for Gwoja, Mr. Clinton Howe, the member for Drysdale, Justine Davis, the member for Johnston, and also telecommunicating in is the member for Wanguri, Miss Ollie Carlson. Would you like to make an opening statement?
I guess given the time, I might just skip any opening statements. The majority of our concerns are outlined in the submission. We made the written submission. I guess primarily that we are concerned that this legislation does change the previous principles of ecologically sustainable development in favour of just economic development. Given that Palmerston is such a significant urban environment, we are concerned for the social and economic, I don't know who that was, the social and economic outcomes for our community. We're also concerned about any significant projects where the council may have our wishes and our concerns and things through planning overruled by the removal of conditions in urban development. So that's a summary, and
I'd just like to remind to please have phones off in this area, and thank you. I'll open it up to the committee then for questions.
Yeah.
To Justine Davis.
Thank you. Thank you for appearing. And just following on from what you were just saying, I wonder whether you could give any examples of how your concerns in terms of the Territory Coordinator's role, what specific developments in Palmerston or surrounding areas you're concerned about, or an example of how you believe this bill could negatively impact a development in your local community.
I think for us there's two main issues. Firstly is that the City of Palmerston has had extensive urban subdivision for a number of decades. We are the fastest growing area in the Northern Territory, and the Territory Controller Bill provides clauses that will allow an area to be declared as an area that may then undergo exemptions, planning exemptions, conditions on planning, and the council relies on other processes through the Development Consent Authority, building approvals, and we have conditions placed on particularly development to meet council's guidelines and requirements. There are times where we may be in disagreement with developers about the suitability of infrastructure, things like stormwater, the adequacy of stormwater drains, retention basins, and other things that may, if they're not constructed appropriately, cause harm to the community in, say, a major rain event with upstream flooding. The council is expected to take on these assets, roads, stormwater drains, and manage them long into the future, in some cases well over 100 years. So if they're not adequately designed and the conditions that we place on a development permit permit through the DCA are overruled, we may see ourselves in a situation where council becomes liable for people's private properties flooding. Just outside of the city of Palmerston, I think everyone's aware of the developments at Middle Arm. We all want to make sure that those developments are done in a way that is safe for the community. The council does not hold a position either way on whether the proposal at Middle Arm is going to be unhealthy for our community or not. We just expect that there are reasonable oversights into the environment and the ecological sustainability of the area, and making sure that the people in Palmerston, who are the largest regional centre to that area, are safe.
Thank you. And I note that the Legat has pointed out some of the risks that they see in their submission to local councils in terms of this bill, with some of the things that you're outlining there. I was just looking for which I will find and quote back to you. Maybe I'll hand over to someone else while I look for that.
Just following on from that line of question, Madam Mayor, the concern is that the Territory Coordinator could come in terms of a planning decision, do a development, and then it could end up at a standoff between a council not accepting a development because it's not at their guidelines, whether it's stormwater, drainage guidelines or so forth, because it doesn't comply with those. So that then could end up in a legal challenge around who then is legally liable for that infrastructure, because council, it's not at their guidelines, they're not going to accept it. So then it would potentially by default end up in either no person's land or the responsibility of the Northern Territory Government to deliver what would potentially be a local government service. Is that correct?
That is one of the risks if council refuses to accept the asset. The other risk is that if we end up in a disagreement with a developer about the suitability of engineering, that the Territory Controller may come in over the top and force the issue in favour of one party or the other, rather than the two parties mediating what should be a sensible solution between the two opposing opinions. Currently, we engage the services of independent assessors or where we have a dispute with a developer. So there's a risk that process that we have worked on for quite a long time with some of our developers in our area would then be set aside for the position of one party or the other. I guess whoever's got the stronger hold of the Territory Controller at that time.
Great. And I mean, I've just noted in your submission, you raised concerns. You also raised potential benefits for local communities. We spoke to the Nhulunbuy Corporation this morning around, and we posed this question to them, and I'm asking you as a local council, should there be a formal requirement for local councils and traditional owners to approve territory development areas before they're declared?
I think we would like to have a say in the approval of it, at least some consultation on the matters that may affect our council and our community and our decision making. I think just generally there are other ways of going around sorting out development and getting it done in a more timely manner, or getting better coordination and cooperation from the NT government agencies, rather than having an individual come over the top. So I think, we'd like to always be part of the conversation. We'd always like to have an opportunity to hear all sides of the argument about why it needs to be one of these particularly designated areas, and what would be the sticking points for our community.
Yeah, and I'm going to hand over. I think my committee colleague has a question about the City of Palmerston in a minute, the member for Drysdale. But just wanting to confirm, Palmerston City Council is very much advocating that the authority around zoning and land use planning is one that the Palmerston City Council remains actively in control of or involved in shaping that, given you are the custodians of the municipality, essentially.
Yep, so while we don't have ultimate control over it, we do have a significant say currently as a statutory authority, especially for the roads and other assets that we will acquire at the end of a development. The zoning is particularly interesting because most of the Northern Territory isn't zoned. And I think the bill was sort of targeting areas which are effectively unzoned, the big developments such as the Beetaloo. But this legislation has thrown in that potential for development and changing land uses and other things like that within what are the urban areas and within what councils generally would have a say over.
Over to you, Drysdale.
Do you have any?
Thanks for coming in, Mayor, and thanks so far. There's some really actually good, tangible outcomes we've got there. I've got 3 points I'd like to go over. One is to continue on with other concerns you have. I know you just spoke of zoning. My microphone is now on. Yeah, so you've spoke of zoning. If you could elaborate on that piece and any other tangible concerns you've got.
I guess zoning is just one of those things that the territory controller can come and make decisions on. As it is, we have zones, people make applications through the Development Consent Authority for planning to rezone areas for their particular development. Council has a say on that.
Yeah, so I guess the issue.
I don't really see why the territory controller would need to intervene in rezoning an area because it's generally not something that's heavily contested.
Yep. No, thank you for that. I also look at, you've mentioned some benefits. Where do you see the benefits for the council in this legislation? And are there areas that have been particularly difficult for council in the past as well, with it working with NTG?
I might pass that question over to Nadine because it's generally the staff that work with the Northern Territory government.
Yeah, so thank you. I think we see it as potentially a way to facilitate the conversation between the parties rather than at the moment the government acts as kind of the middleman in it all. So even if we're trying to negotiate with the developer, the government's in the middle of it instead of it's all being three equal kind of how do we get to where we need to go. So we see there's a potential opportunity to where the coordinator could facilitate that conversation without it. At the moment, we often have to request meetings that have everyone there to get everyone to the table. We're trying to facilitate, but we have no powers to facilitate. So it's out of relationships and negotiation to try to get somewhere rather than someone kind of stepping away from it going, okay, where are we at? What's going on? So we kind of, that's a potential benefit to it, not for the developments, but also more broadly about getting all the relevant stakeholders in the room in an appropriate way.
So the
whole process is government.
So it's fair to say, like, the territory coordinator could facilitate greater consultation of affected parties in a more level playing field.
Potentially, and I think that's where it leads to our concern, though, that if the government or the developer has that slightly stronger push or whatever it might be, we're not adequately heard. So that's the risk as well.
So
Yeah.
it kind of, it's
Yeah.
both ways, yeah.
Are there any other, specifically to the bill, are there any points you have recommendations for that you would like to see changed? Any inclusions, exclusions? Are there any particular points you would like to see in our recommendations?
Nothing really specific.
Yep.
No, sorry.
That's all. That's all from me.
Back to the member for Johnston.
Thank you. And I think you have made some recommendations in your submission, so they're helpful to us. Thank you, or things to consider in terms of how the bill could address some of the concerns that you've raised. But you did say in your submission, and you said this morning, that your primary concern is that the Territory Coordinator appears to prioritise economic development at the expense of ecologically sustainable development principles. I'm just wondering whether, once again, you've given some examples already, whether you've got any specific examples of concerns you could share with us. And the other thing I'll say is that we know that this bill is likely to pass, and given that that's the situation, whether you have any recommendations for how your concerns could be addressed with any amendments to the bill.
Okay. And this is external to Palmerston, but I can see that the flow and effect would affect our community. I know everyone's very keen to see, a lot of people are very keen to see the Beetaloo developed for that gas industry. And I do understand that there is now baseline environmental, social and cultural information around the communities in that area. But if we were to prioritise economic development at the expense of social and cultural factors, there's a potential that we could see more people displaced and disenfranchised from the regional areas, and they wind up in the metropolitan areas. A lot of the problems we see, social problems within the municipality, relate to people who come in from outer areas, regional areas, and bring their social issues with them. So if we're going to prioritise economic development over social and cultural factors, there is a risk that declining socio-economic conditions in regional areas, instead of increasing socio-economic advantage, could adversely affect urban areas when we see more people displaced. Does that give you an example of where I think it would cause us?
Yeah, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the economic impact of that for you, if and when that does happen.
I think the economic impact of those that have gainful employment will be much better off, but potentially those who don't see their socio-economic conditions improve through that sort of economic development won't get the opportunities that everyone else gets. I know it's a different question as to how you ensure that people in regional areas also get economic benefit and social benefit from these types of developments. But when you're prioritising only economic development, there is the risk that the social and cultural and also the ecological factors will be set aside in favour of just economic growth.
And we've heard through some of our witnesses this morning, we've discussed that sometimes economic development is seen as in opposition to sustainable development. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, but also just coming back to my earlier question about whether you have any thoughts on any amendments that could be made to this bill to try and address those concerns.
Yep, certainly. Look, I don't see that economic development is in opposition to ecological or social factors at all. They can go hand in hand, especially when they are done appropriately. And we do see then people getting appropriate education and training and getting employment opportunities through that development. But if they're not considered, and that's, you know, the whole reason why development right across the globe has gone to ecologically sustainable development is to make sure that communities are brought along with those socioeconomic advantages. I'm a bit hesitant to say that you should completely change the primary focus. It's very clear that primary focus is for economic development, but there should be sufficient consideration given to the other factors as well to ensure that communities are not disadvantaged.
And so I'm not sure if you can answer this or not, but what would sufficient consideration look like to you if that was included?
I think there needs to be real consideration of any disadvantage from a particular development, especially to social and cultural outcomes.
Before a decision's made? Sorry, you go.
Or even during the development process, so that there are some ways of measuring a stop point to say, you know, social conditions are not improving and therefore we need to revisit or stop and make sure that we are getting the social and cultural development that we require in our remote regions as well, and not just focusing on the economic benefit, which will mostly flow to urban environments.
So some built-in robust evaluation processes as part of the bill?
Yep.
Thank you.
Just got one question.
Yep.
I guess this is a question in relation to planning decisions and zoning decisions being made by a territory coordinator and not that of a local government. That could potentially result in an increase in rates, I would assume, given that the infrastructure could be very demanding infrastructure to service and maintain. Is that correct?
It would really depend on what the rezoning is for, because some zones may not be rateable as well, depending on where it is. I'm sure you're aware that, and it doesn't affect Palmerston so much, but a lot of the pastoral leases aren't rated the same as other areas. Mining wouldn't be rated the same way. But things like urban development, yes, we do get rates from housing lots. We do get rates from commercial lots and industrial lots. But remember too, council doesn't have the ultimate say in zoning. It is done by a different authority. It is an NT government authority, and we do have a say in that. We're just concerned that the cooperation and discussion that goes on between the various agencies would be overwritten by a territory controller decision.
Sure. So if a subdivision, and I'm not going to name any, but if a subdivision were to happen and infrastructure is put in, community spaces, roads, drainage, all of that, it's done by a territory coordinator, their local council has no decision making or input into it, yet you're going to be left, well, not you, but that local council is going to be left to foot the bill for the ongoing maintenance charges and the asset maintenance of that indefinitely, but you haven't been involved in any of that, could potentially result in a rate increase to maintain that asset.
Yep. I mean, that could be a risk if we already are the landowner and that zoning changes and the infrastructure is altered against our wishes.
Yep.
But Nadine might have something more to add to that.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, it's not just the infrastructure of how wide the road is. Like, that's not ideal if it doesn't last as long. That's going to have a cost impact, as an example. Or having to rebuild the stormwater infrastructure because it wasn't adequate. It's going to have a cost impact, but it's often the immediate impact is the quality or the service level that community gets. So the parks might not be sufficient, or the pathway networks to be able to have accessibility or community infrastructure like community halls might not be sufficient because the priority was to release the land and get it done. So yes, there'll be rates for that, the technical bits of the infrastructure can get managed, not ideal if there's big problems with it. It's more what's that community then going to have, and sometimes it's a lower level of service, not necessarily a cost thing. So then there's a catch up to do of, well, that park needs to have a bigger playground, or it needs to have shade it didn't have, or we need to install more footpaths so people can get access, or we need to lobby the government to get access to land to build a new community hall. So that's the kind of, it's bigger than just the cost, it's that bigger impact.
Yeah, great.
As well, if the priority is just to release the land for economic development, it's the consideration of all those other factors along the way.
Yeah.
There are some other issues that may arise in terms of rezoning land. You're probably aware of the Palmerston CBD area. It's significantly underdeveloped, and that causes a lot of social issues, particularly in the evenings and overnight, because there is a significant lack of people and visibility in the city centre. That is a result of other pieces of land being rezoned for commercial development outside of our city centre and dragging a lot of that foot traffic and passive surveillance outside of our city centre. So there are concerns too that if there is a big push for another significant project and rezoning outside of what the council understands is the best interests of our community, it may then further exacerbate that by drawing businesses and other foot traffic and passive surveillance further out of what was originally intended to be our city centre. So, you know, it's important that council has a say on these things and that our concerns are understood, because we are here locally every day and have visibility into that. It's very difficult for someone who's not actively living in the community to understand those social conditions and the concerns.
Just as a follow-up question to that, Mayor, we heard, you know, a case where we could have a increase in rates. Would it be fair to say too the Territory Coordinator could help facilitate those developments in our underdeveloped CBD, increasing, and with, if a Territory Coordinator is ensuring councils listen to appropriate zoning, could that see a decrease in rates as well in a best case scenario?
Look, I think as far as the CBD is concerned, the council, without the assistance of the Territory Controller, can work with developers to, you know, build and establish the city centre. We just don't have an appetite of the current landholders to do that, and there are a whole lot of other factors around that. So I don't know that we'd actually need the Territory Controller to intervene in our city centre. For other areas, potentially it could see a decline in our rate base depending on what development goes on there or what we have projected, because we do look forward around up to 50 years in some of our areas about what development is likely to go there. And we have modelled that, and we have made acquisitions of previously unincorporated land based on that modelling. And so if it is rezoned to something that we weren't expecting, it could then alter our future projections of what we see the city to be in the next 50 years, the financial sustainability.
On behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank you for appearing today and taking the time out of your busy day to be here. Did you have one more?
Oh, I have one more little question.
If it's a short answer, we'll let Justine ask one more question.
Just one more brief question, because I think we haven't touched on it. And you said it was, in terms of your recommendations, it was your sort of second recommendation, which is that there's a more transparent process if this is implemented. And I just wondered whether you could talk very briefly to what that might look like.
I think we need just a very robust consultation and discussion around it. especially if the Territory Controller is intending to come in and make decisions. The community needs to be aware of the reasons for it and why. Obviously, the other statutory authorities, such as the council, should have a significant amount of input into those decisions and the ability to raise our concerns. I think that's basically, what we're asking for. There needs to be some transparency around it, rather than just being able to make a decision and say this is how it's going to be.
Thank you.
Thank you for the answer, and thank you for taking the time to do a submission and meeting with us with a short notice. It's been very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you.
Thank you.